Hello, my name is Eric Hibbert, and I'm with Samsung. And today I'd like to talk to you about an upcoming change to the storage security standards within ISO. Basically, there's a update that's underway, and we think this is actually going to have some positive effects in the storage industry. So this is the SNIA legal notice. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not giving you any consulting, no warranties expressed or implied. Use at your own risk in this material. All right, this was the abstract. And we're basically going to look at what's known as ISO 27040 or 27040, which is the storage security standard. All right, so a little bit of background to sort of set the context. The actual roots of this project, the 27040 project, started way back in the 2008 timeframe when SNIA was developing storage security best current practices. If you go to the SNIA site, you actually could find some of these documents in the form of very ancient white papers that haven't been updated in a long time. These materials served as a catalyst, and when the US was reviewing the 27033 standard, which deals with network security. And what we found is that storage networking had been excluded from that series. We had originally hoped that a new part could be added to that. So with that exclusion, the US proposed in February 2010 a study period. That's essentially, you're trying to determine whether a standard is warranted or not. And ultimately, the decision was made that yes, a standard in the storage security space, not just limited to storage networking, would be of value. And that project started in October of 2010. So after many, many months, several years, 27040, the first edition, was published in January 2015. Now, the significance of that publication is it was the same time, almost the same time, as the NIST Special Publication 888, which was dealing with media sanitization, a topic, as you'll see, that's part of 27040. It was published in December of 2014, and there was a lot of effort to keep those two standards synchronized, one focused on the US, one internationally. So with the publication of 27040, it turns out that as time marches on, so do the attackers and vulnerabilities. And there was an effort to do an early revision on 27040, and that initiated in April of 2019. And essentially, as you can see here, work is sort of marched on. There was a new work item proposal was approved. There have been 3 working drafts, 1 committee draft that have been balloted. Those all concluded in December of 2021. And at this point, the text for the draft international standard was submitted in May of 2022. And we expected the ballot to commence, in the next couple of months. But we think that given current schedules, that ballot will close in roughly October of 2022. Now, this is the last opportunity to introduce technical changes to the standard. All right, so when we talk about storage security, and obviously I've given a rundown on 27040, its history. What are the drivers? Well, there's concerns about things on the order of theft or loss to storage devices, accidental configuration changes, malicious configuration changes, privileged user abuse, malicious data tampering, denial of service attacks, and malicious monitoring of networks. All of these can result in data breaches, and depending on the jurisdiction that you're in, these could have significant impacts. And one of the things that we saw with, for example, Europeans, there was a fundamental change in what constituted data breach. simple corruption or destruction might constitute that. And that was something that definitely got the attention of the storage industry. All right, so the original 27040 was really focused in two ways. One is it at a high level tracked the network security standards, which looked at implementation guidance and risk and a variety of things. And then some of the structure in the SNIA best practices. But to the end of the day, the controls were essentially matched to worrying about things like direct attached storage and storage networking, storage management, file and block-based storage, a little bit on cloud, some on object-based storage. There was some early work on storage virtualization, and then sanitization and encryption. And then there were a couple of additional items that were kind of interesting. Secure multi-tenancy and secure autonomous data movement were included. And these last two, in the case of secure autonomous data movement, sort of track back to the almost 2007 timeframe when SNIA was looking at information lifecycle management. As you can see, this is one of the figures from the standard. It was looking at a sort of a broad space of when you're looking at networking, how you may be crossing protocols and multi-sites and different kinds of technologies. So it really was intended in some ways to educate the security community on what was happening with regard to storage. And in point of fact, you could actually be moving data around the world without the servers actually having visibility that this data was actually moving around. So the storage infrastructure had gotten very sophisticated, and that was not commonly known. And depending on how it was being configured, it may or may not be done securely. This also caught the attention of the legal community in the early days of e-discovery and where data could reside. So with 27040, clearly there were some challenges. This was a first time out for a standard. As a starting point, it was written as a guidance standard, so there weren't any requirements. So this is, shoulds versus shalls. So if you think about that, should equals, well, optional. In other words, nothing was actually mandated. So there was no baseline securities on this. And so you couldn't really use the standard for any sort of compliance. You couldn't use it for, from vendor perspective, you could make claims that you conform, but it was without meaning. Likewise, on the customer side, which is really what 27040 is written from the perspective of, it was hard for them, customers, to use it from a procurement standpoint. You had to very carefully word your language to be able to sort of invoke the shoulds and convert them into shalls, if you will. There were over 330 controls that were in the document, and because they're all shoulds, they're all optional, that means it's really difficult to figure out which ones you should prioritize, which ones you should deal with. So there's a special annex. Annex B was set up to kind of help figure out where your focus was. So if availability or confidentiality, the CIA piece, integrity being the I, you could focus on one of those, and you could see which controls were most helpful in that sense. There was also another approach of looking at data sensitivity and which controls would help you, depending on the sensitivity of data. And it was like low sensitivity cafeteria menu versus maybe trade secret kinds of things. So that offered some guidance, but the usefulness of that annex was it actually had all 330 plus controls listed in some fashion, and so you could essentially use that as a punch sheet if you were looking at storage infrastructure from an audit perspective. The document, as I mentioned earlier, had an annex, Annex A, which was synchronized with the NIST 888, dealing with media sanitization. specific types of sanitization. So if you wanted to see how to make data go away, for example, on an iPhone first generation, or zip drives or Bernoullis, you notice that some of these names are not necessarily commonplace today, but back when the standard was being developed, those were technologies that were readily available. The problem with this standard is that some of those forms of media were already kind of on the edge of being, whether they were being used or not. And there was no way to add new technologies without doing an update to the standard. And from a timeline wise, updates can take 3 years to go through the revision cycle. So this was not an ideal situation where we're seeing technologies added, every couple of years. We also saw that there were changes in techniques and procedures. For example, using degaussing, and if you were using sort of pulverizing, whether that was going to be adequate or not, and some of those needed to be adjusted. Then again, without doing a full revision of the standard, there was no way to deal with that. Another problem was that in the 27,000 series, there was really no pointers to 27040 for any of the contents. So it was a new standard. It wasn't known to the series, and so we had to sort of wait until revisions of some of these other documents before it would basically have a connection. But first outing, it was effectively a standalone document. However, it did have pointers back to, in particular, 27002, which is one of the important documents for the 27,000 series. There were a couple of notable sort of missing elements. There wasn't a section on data protection, which in the storage world is not privacy, but it covers things like backups and CDP and whatnot. And so some of the specific technologies were there, but data protection as a general category wasn't there. And there was nothing on archives or repositories, although there was some language around data retention, which wasn't necessarily all that helpful. There were also several storage technologies that were at the time thought that they would be sort of more common use. It turns out they ended up being very sort of niche oriented and very, very limited adoption. And so, they took up space in the standard, but they really had, minimal impacts on the storage industry. Okay, so with that backdrop on 27040, let's take a look at what's going on. All right, so what were the key drivers for revising 27040? Well, one of those was to see if we could establish a baseline of storage security controls. When I say baseline, I mean these are the things that are mandatory, sort of a minimum set. So we get out of this situation where you've got 300 plus controls, all of equal weighting, and you don't know which ones to sort of focus on. Definitely a desire to improve the alignment of 27,002. This became an important issue with the revision of 27,002, which is, there's another talk on this, but basically a complete restructuring. And it did actually have some references to 27040. So there was a need to make sure that what was being pointed at actually had useful content. The obsolete stuff, niche stuff basically needed to be removed, and missing or new needed to be added. There was a lot of tutorial material in the original standard. It was in Annex C. Since the original authoring of the standard, significant white papers and external materials have been produced, and so it was deemed that was just basically taking up space. The bigger problem is over time it needed to be adjusted, and the return on investment of that just wasn't there. So there was a decision to eliminate as much of that as possible. And last but not least is figuring out how to come up with a way of maintaining the storage media sanitization materials such that it could be a bit more nimble. So things that need to be added, things that need to be removed. And so that was sort of a core to figure out how to deal with in the new revision. Okay. So with the project approved and underway, so where did this go? Well, one of the biggies is the structure is now tracking the new 2702. So the controls are organized along organizational, people, physical, and technological controls. That's a pretty big change. The scope was modified to include requirements. And just to give you an idea of how that's impacted doc. So these are shall statements. So under organizational, there's one requirement with several other guidance items, one under physical, and 30 under technological. And you can see the breakdown here where they're covering things like systems hardening, storage management, encryption and key management, sanitization, some of the NFS, SMB language, and a couple around CDMI, which is in the cloud storage space. So these are now what we would call sort of baseline. So if you're dealing with these technology areas, now there are shall statements that carry some additional weight. So continuing, what else changed? Well, in the case of media sanitization, the standard now defers to a brand new IEEE standard, it's 2883, that deals with media-specific sanitization. The old Annex A that contained all this stuff has been removed. The beauty of this scenario is 2883 had basically came into existence in roughly 14 months. So cradle to grave on that. And so revisions can happen at a much more rapid pace. 2883 is a standalone document. There's another talk on that at the Security Summit that you may want to catch. But what we've got now is a connection between 27040 and 2883. Another aspect of sanitization dealt with is clarification of things like verification and cryptographic erase. There's also a new labeling scheme. Some of what we saw with the 2702 revision, we liked what they were doing, and so certain controls and clusters of controls have labels on them so that we can use them as a way to put together checklists, if you will. And these also make it clear as to whether you're dealing with a requirement or guidance. So all of these controls have been summarized in a new Annex A that will basically make it easier to run through the materials. And of course, all the tutorial materials in Annex C are basically eliminated. And in the cases where we needed to add a little bit of descriptive material, those have been pulled into the normative parts of the document. All right, so new controls. We've added some materials on expertise of storage administrators. Design and implementation has got some materials on integrity as well as retention, preservation, and disposal of data. Vulnerability management was added to storage system security. IPMI, which is the little known bit of technology, has been added. We've added some materials on NVMe over fabrics. Storage backups have been enhanced to give a little better coverage for 2702, and we've added cyber attack recovery backups as well. And then data archives and repositories were also added. So 27040 has undergone this pretty massive change. It's definitely underway at the moment, but we think it's going to be usable by vendors who can now make conformance claims, and customers in their tenders, and even auditors, because it now provides criteria that they can use. We see that 2702, the version that was just published in February of this year, points to 27040 for media standardization and backups. And so when the new version comes out, it will supersede the existing one, and the new materials will be covered. And so when is this new version 27040 due out? Well, we're anticipating that it'll be published by February of 2023. It could be earlier than that, but we don't think it'll be any later than that. So that's the update on 27040. Thank you for your time, and please take time to rate this session.